Air India Flight 171. On June 12, 2025, Air India Flight 171 took off from Ahmedabad bound for London. Just 32 seconds later, it was gone. The Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, carrying 242 people, lost thrust in both engines after its fuel control switches mysteriously flipped from run to cut off. At just 625 feet above sea level, there was no time to recover. The aircraft slammed into the hostel block of BJ Medical College, barely a mile from the runway. The devastation was overwhelming. 241 of the 242 on board perished, along with 19 people on the ground. The fires raged so hot, around 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,500 degrees Celsius, that DNA testing was needed to identify remains. Among the dead was former Gujarat Chief Minister Vijay Rupani. Yet out of the inferno, one man lived. 40-year-old British passenger Vishwas Kumar Ramesh, seated in 11A next to an emergency exit. His section broke off, and he crawled out with minor injuries, only to later bury his brother who had also been on the flight. The tragedy was historic. This was the first ever fatal crash of a Boeing 787 since its debut in 2011. Investigators found no sign of bird strikes or weather issues. Instead, the cockpit recorder captured a chilling exchange. One pilot asked the other why he had cut the engines, and the reply was, "I did not." Rescue efforts were massive. Over 300 firefighters, 60 fire vehicles, and Army and disaster response teams swarmed the site. Tata Group, Air India's parent company, promised $120,000 to every victim's family, while international investigators from the US, UK, and India joined the probe. Boeing's stock even plunged 9% as questions mounted. In the end, a cutting-edge aircraft with 41,868 flight hours became a fireball in under a minute. The unanswered mystery, how both switches moved to cutoff, still haunts aviation experts worldwide. China Eastern Airlines Flight 5735. On March 21, 2022, a Boeing 737-800 carrying 132 people left Kunming for Guangzhou. Just over an hour into the flight, the aircraft suddenly plunged from 29,100 feet. Within 2 minutes, it was nearly vertical, at times dropping faster than 32,000 feet per minute. Villagers near Teng County, Guangxi, heard a massive explosion as the plane slammed into the hillside at speeds close to the speed of sound. The impact created a crater 100 feet wide and 66 feet deep, leaving no survivors. The crew included an experienced 59-year-old first officer with over 31,000 flight hours, a young captain with 6,700 hours, and a 27-year-old second officer still in training. All 123 passengers and 9 crew were Chinese, spanning 74 families across 17 provinces. The recovery effort mobilized over 650 rescuers and 450 firefighters, battling forest fires, heavy rain, and landslide risks. By the end of March, investigators had collected 49,117 pieces of wreckage, and both black boxes were recovered, one buried 5 feet deep. The cockpit voice recorder was badly damaged but intact enough for analysis. Speculation immediately erupted. Data suggested the controls had been pushed into a dive, fueling suspicions of a deliberate crash from inside the cockpit. Reports indicated no distress calls, no attempt at emergency landing, and even the flaps and landing gear were never deployed. American investigators quietly signaled the data pointed toward human intent, though Chinese officials called such reports misleading. The crash was the deadliest in China since the 1990s and the worst in 2022 worldwide. Boeing's stock fell nearly 8%, and China Eastern canceled 89% of its flights the following day. Yet, 3 years later, Chinese authorities have not released a final report, citing risks to national security and societal stability. For families, the unanswered questions weigh almost as heavily as the tragedy itself. Jeju Air Flight 2216. In late December 2024, a routine flight turned tragic when Jeju Air Flight 2216, a Boeing 737-800, was nearing its destination in Muon County, South Korea. With 181 people on board, 175 passengers, and 6 crew members, the plane was preparing to land when a flock of migratory ducks, identified as Baikal teal, was ingested into both engines. The pilots declared a mayday after losing thrust in the right engine and attempted a go-around. On their second approach, the landing gear failed to deploy, and the aircraft belly landed on the runway, skidding for 3,900 feet. It then overran the runway, crashing into a concrete berm that supported an antenna array for the instrument landing system. This catastrophic impact killed 179 people, including all passengers and 4 crew members. The only two survivors were flight attendants seated in the rear of the plane, which detached from the main fuselage. They were rescued with injuries, one with fractures to his ribs and spine, and the other with head and ankle injuries. An investigation revealed a shocking discovery. The pilots may have mistakenly shut down the undamaged left engine instead of the severely bird-damaged right one. The crash site was a horrifying scene, with debris scattered up to 984 feet past the berm. Experts later pointed out that the 13-foot-high concrete barrier the plane struck was a dangerous, non-frangible structure that violated international safety standards and likely contributed to the high fatality count. Muan International Airport had a history of bird strikes, with a rate of 0.09%, significantly higher than major airports like Gimpo's 0.018%. The airline itself faced scrutiny after it was revealed the same aircraft had a previous incident in 2021, a tail strike that caused structural damage for which Jeju Air was fined $1.5 million. This disaster marked the deadliest aviation accident involving a South Korean airliner since 1997. American Airlines Flight 587. On the morning of November 12, 2001, American Airlines Flight 587 lifted off from JFK Airport bound for Santo Domingo. Just 3 minutes later, it tore through the quiet neighborhood of Bell Harbor, Queens. All 260 people on board and 5 residents on the ground were killed. With 265 lives lost, it became the second deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history that wasn't linked to terrorism. The timing was haunting. New York was still reeling from the attacks of September 11th, just 2 months earlier. The sight of an airliner plunging into a neighborhood instantly raised fears of another plot. Buildings like the Empire State and United Nations headquarters were evacuated, but the cause turned out to be far more tragic and preventable. The Airbus A300 had taken off behind a Japan Airlines 747, entering the turbulent wake left behind. First Officer Sten Mullen, just 34, reacted by slamming the rudder pedals aggressively, swinging them from side to side. Within seconds, the forces reached over 200,000 pounds of pressure, twice the aircraft's design limits. The vertical stabilizer snapped off, plunging into Jamaica Bay, followed by both engines detaching. At 9:16 a.m., the jet slammed into the ground. The investigation revealed chilling details. If Mullen had stopped making inputs, the plane would have stabilized on its own. But American Airlines' training had drilled pilots to overreact to turbulence, simulating extreme rolls that rarely happen in reality. Combined with the highly sensitive rudder system of the A300, the fatal overcorrection was almost inevitable. Among the victims was Hilda Yolanda Mayol, who had survived the collapse of the North Tower on September 11th, only to perish on this flight. The Dominican community in New York, which made up nearly 90% of the passengers, was devastated. The crash left scars that went beyond aviation. It struck at the heart of 2 grieving cities already burdened by loss. Germanwings Flight 9525. On March 24, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525, an Airbus A320 carrying 150 people, took off from Barcelona, Spain, bound for Dusseldorf, Germany. The flight was a little behind schedule, but otherwise unremarkable, until about 30 minutes into the journey, when it reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. This is when the unthinkable began. The captain left the cockpit, and in a chilling turn of events, the co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, locked the door behind him. Lubitz, a 27-year-old with a troubled past that included treatment for suicidal tendencies, then did something horrifying. He intentionally set the autopilot to begin a rapid descent. Over the next 10 minutes, as the plane plummeted towards the ground, the captain desperately tried to re-enter the cockpit. His frantic knocks and attempts to break down the reinforced door were met with silence from inside, though the cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of Lubitz's steady, calm breathing. Air traffic controllers too tried to contact the plane, but got no response. At 10:41 a.m., the aircraft slammed into a mountain in the French Alps at a speed of 435 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact. There were no survivors. The largest piece of wreckage found was about the size of a car. The horrifying fact that this was not an accident but a deliberate act of mass murder came to light through the analysis of the flight data and voice recorders. It was a tragic end for 144 passengers and 6 crew members, including 16 students and 2 teachers returning from an exchange trip and 2 opera singers. Air France Flight 4590. On July 25, 2000, one of aviation's most glamorous machines, the Concorde, met its tragic end just minutes after leaving Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport. Air France Flight 4590 was bound for New York, carrying 100 passengers and 9 crew members, most of them Germans headed for a luxury cruise. None would survive. The supersonic jet struck debris left behind by a Continental Airlines DC-10, which sliced open a tire at 185 miles per hour. A 9.9-pound chunk of rubber slammed into the wing at nearly 310 miles per hour, sending a shockwave through the fuel tank. In seconds, flames erupted as engines 1 and 2 failed. The landing gear jammed and the aircraft struggled to climb. Barely 2 minutes later, it crashed into a hotel in Gonesse, killing 113 people in total. The accident was especially devastating because Concorde had flown for 27 years without a fatal crash. But this disaster grounded the entire fleet. Investigators later discovered the aircraft was also 1,790 pounds over its maximum weight, with last-minute luggage and extra fuel tipping its balance even further back. Aborting the takeoff wasn't possible. By the time the flames were spotted, the jet had already passed V1 speed, the point of no return. The fallout was enormous. The Concorde returned to service only after $38 million in safety upgrades, including Kevlar-lined fuel tanks and reinforced tires. But the magic was gone. Passenger demand collapsed after 9/11, and by 2003, both Air France and British Airways retired the supersonic legend. A criminal trial later found Continental Airlines partly responsible, with a French court ordering $1.27 million in fines and damages, though the convictions were overturned on appeal. For a plane that once promised champagne at Mach 2, its fiery end became the enduring image. The Concorde went from a marvel of engineering to a cautionary tale of how one stray piece of metal, no larger than 17 inches, could end an era. Japan Airlines Flight 123. On August 12, 1985, a routine domestic flight in Japan turned into the deadliest single aircraft disaster in aviation history. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747-SR-46, lifted off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport at 6:12 p.m., bound for Osaka. Just 12 minutes later, at 24,000 feet, the aircraft suffered a violent explosive decompression. A faulty repair from a 1978 tail strike, done incorrectly by Boeing technicians, had finally failed. The repair job was supposed to use one continuous plate. Instead, 2 smaller plates were used, weakening the bulkhead. After 12,318 pressurization cycles, the structure gave way, blowing off the vertical stabilizer and cutting all 4 hydraulic systems. The 747 became almost uncontrollable. For the next 32 minutes, the cockpit crew, Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, fought desperately to control the crippled giant using nothing but engine thrust. Their struggle was recorded in hauntingly calm voices, even as hypoxia clouded their judgment. Passengers endured violent oscillations, banking rolls of nearly 50 degrees, and terrifying drops. Many wrote farewell letters as the plane wandered back toward Tokyo, never able to descend safely. At 6:56 p.m., Flight 123 slammed into Mount Takamagahara, about 62 miles from Tokyo. Of the 524 people on board, 520 died. Only 4 women survived, all seated toward the rear of the plane. Among the dead was pop star Kyu Sakamoto, known worldwide for his hit Sukiyaki. Tragedy deepened when rescuers delayed reaching the site until the next morning. Doctors later confirmed that dozens, possibly 20 to 50 passengers, had survived the initial impact but died overnight from injuries, shock, and exposure. The aftermath shattered Japan's trust in its national airline. JAL's president resigned, and even engineers connected to the earlier repair took their own lives out of guilt. The disaster became a grim lesson in aviation maintenance, leading to safety reforms worldwide and inspiring later pilots, such as those on United Airlines Flight 232, to use differential thrust to save lives. British Midland Airways Flight 092. On the night of January 8, 1989, British Midland Airways Flight 092 was climbing out of London Heathrow when disaster struck. At 28,300 feet, a fan blade in the left engine snapped off, sending violent vibrations and smoke into the cabin. Passengers sitting near the rear could see sparks and flames. But inside the cockpit, the pilots faced a deadly puzzle. Both were highly experienced, but they had logged only 76 hours on the brand new Boeing 737-400. They trusted their instincts, assuming the right engine was at fault, because that's how earlier 737 models worked. They shut down the wrong engine. The aircraft diverted toward East Midlands Airport, but as the crippled left engine was pushed harder during final approach, the trapped blade tip dislodged, tore into the core, and ignited a fire. At just 900 feet above the ground, the 737 lost all thrust. Seconds later, It struck the M1 motorway embankment at 132 miles per hour, breaking apart into 3 sections. Miraculously, no vehicles were hit. Of the 126 people on board, 47 lost their lives, while 74 suffered serious injuries. All 8 crew members survived. First responders included not only firefighters, but also motorists and even SAS soldiers who happened to be nearby. The investigation revealed that poor training on the 737-400's new systems, misleading cockpit instruments, and a design flaw in the engine combined to create catastrophe. Boeing had not tested the upgraded CFM56 engines in real flight conditions. Ground testing failed to reveal dangerous vibrations at high power. That oversight grounded 99 aircraft worldwide until modifications were made. The crash left a lasting legacy. It reshaped training, redefined brace positions for passengers, and forced mandatory in-flight testing for redesigned engines. A single wrong assumption in the cockpit turned a routine hop into one of the UK's most haunting air disasters. Scandinavian Airlines System Flight 686. On the morning of October 8, 2001, Milan's Linate Airport was wrapped in a thick blanket of fog, visibility dropping to less than 660 feet. A small Cessna Citation CJ2, carrying 4 people bound for Paris, took a wrong turn while taxiing. With no working ground radar, worn-out taxiway signs, and safety sensors switched off, the pilots unknowingly rolled onto the active runway. At that very moment, a Scandinavian Airlines MD-87, packed with 110 passengers and crew heading for Copenhagen, was given clearance for takeoff. Just 53 seconds later, traveling at 150 knots, 170 miles per hour, the MD-87 slammed into the Cessna. The impact tore off its right engine and landing gear, yet the crew managed to lift the jet briefly into the air. It reached just 35 feet before pilots reduced engine power after noticing a loss of thrust due to debris ingestion. The jet skidded off the runway at over 156 miles per hour, plowing into a luggage hangar and erupting into flames. Every soul aboard both planes, 114 people in total, was lost, along with 4 ground workers, making 118 fatalities. It became the deadliest disaster in Italian aviation history. The investigation revealed a chilling list of failures. The airport's ground radar had been decommissioned 2 years earlier, and its replacement was delayed. Taxiway markings didn't meet standards. Motion sensors that could have raised alarms were deliberately disabled, and communication between pilots and controllers was riddled with mismatched terminology. The Cessna's pilots, highly experienced but not certified for ultra-low visibility, had landed earlier in just 330 feet of visibility, well below safe limits. Years later, Italian courts convicted airport officials and controllers, though many sentences were reduced or overturned. To honor the victims, a memorial forest of 118 beech trees was planted near the airport, each tree symbolizing a life lost in the fog that morning. The disaster remains a stark reminder of how neglected systems and small errors can converge into catastrophe.